Institutional and cultural challenges. I know that those of us who work for public sector, public entities can probably write a novel, could probably write a novel on some of these challenges and how you wrestle with them in your own organization over time. All of our organizations, but in my experience, frankly, often public entities wrestle with this the most, have these policies, there's procedures, structures, norms, and they're built for good governance, right? They're built for a good reason, but they can make it challenging to implement innovative things. And so some of the traits that we've seen people really wrestle with in public entities is, hey, public entities have a tendency to prioritize risk avoidance over innovation. That's how they're built. If you're working at a water utility, your job is to keep the water, well, depends on what kind of water utility, either coming down or going out, whichever it is, and keep it clean. There's not a lot of incentive there for innovation that's probably nested deeply within your culture, unless you've got a real change leader in your organization that has taken the time to cultivate that. We hear a lot from our public partners who try to implement these kinds of projects about the challenges of navigating through their silos or the lack of coordination. If you're especially in a large public entity where you've got a lot of, let's say, bureaus or silos within your organization or outside of your organization, lack of coordination and information and discussion among those and trust among those can really be a challenge. And we also know that folks who work for city governments or utilities may not represent stakeholders who need to be at the decision-making table. We know that oftentimes our public entity staff are whiter and older than a lot of the communities that they serve. And so folks may or may not have the strong existing relationships with those communities and with the community groups that could help them figure out better solutions together that are really responding. I made the mistake of looking at chat. I'm going to ask my colleagues to let me know if there's something in chat that needs my immediate attention, because I don't do multi-channel processing very well. So what we call interjurisdictional challenges, I hope will sound familiar to our friends in the public sector as well. So when we try to implement multi-sector solutions, we often run into these jurisdictional challenges where there's multiple sectors, there's multiple geographies, agencies, regulations, authorities. Sometimes there's a gap in authority or funding. So you might have a situation where, let's say you've got a stormwater agency and you've got a county government with a floodplain management authority, but you don't have somebody that's really responsible for managing stream side erosion or, some of the more proactive parts of floodplain management. So when we see different entities come together, public entities in specific ways, sometimes there's a gap or an overlap or a conflict between different parts of their authority or their funding environment. Whenever implementation of these multi-sector projects requires coordinated action or investment, that's it's a human problem and it's also a systems problem. And we'll talk about this in more depth when we get to solutions. But, humans are not, and institutions in our culture are not generally built to achieve coordinated action or investment well together. And so getting our institutions to act that way can be a challenge. And our partners are always, whether they're private or public sector or nonprofit sector people, they're responding to different authorities, they're responding to the priorities of different communities that they serve, they have different limitations. And so when we come together to try to work across jurisdictional lines or authorities or roles, then things get gnarly. If this is starting to feel overwhelming, I only have 2 more challenges categories left, and so we will dig ourselves out here. And I hope this is resonating rather than swamping. I never know if I should get deeper or less deep into challenges. So folks talk a lot about funding challenges, and we've talked a lot about funding challenges or heard folks mention that as a priority a lot over the last couple of days here. These complex multi-benefit, what we call InfrastructureNext style projects, can be more difficult to fund. Our experience in general is they're just different and it requires a new skill set. So we'll talk in a minute here about some of the tools in our toolbox for dealing with these, but they often need to, but again, they also have the opportunity to bring in multiple sources of funding. They can draw from different sectors, they can draw from public and private sources in a way that more traditional projects sometimes can't, but that's a pretty unique skill set. So that's a way that a nonprofit partner or somebody who's nested in a different world might be able to help a government entity sort of navigate through these challenges. One of the things we hear a lot from our partners that's just a really pragmatic challenge is that there's limited funding for pre-design work. So we were really excited to see this year state legislation move forward. I believe it was for OWEB, or it may have been also in Oregon, sorry, for our Water Resources Department community engagement work. So being able to use infrastructure funds on community engagement, pre-design, planning, value planning is a really big deal. Oh, I went to a strategy, sorry. Anyway. That's a challenge if we can't do that, right? If you can get implementation dollars for infrastructure, but you can't get the money that you need to really engage your community in that conversation or engage partner organizations, that can be a real challenge. And innovative sometimes does mean harder to fund. You don't fit the profile, you're acting on a different stage again. And so it may just be difficult to, especially if you're working primarily with more traditional funding sources, to convince folks to take a risk and consider a more innovative approach. And my favorite, I warned you that I was a policy wonk, and this is where it's going to be become apparent, is, let me say this. We hear from a lot of infrastructure providers that they know that traditional solutions aren't really meeting their community's needs anymore. They're too expensive, they're too static, they're not resilient to natural disasters or climate change. They're basically just built for past needs and conditions. And so why do we keep implementing them again and again? And I think all of the challenges that we've described here illustrate that, but for many folks, I think the short answer is the old solutions have been implemented before. There are these well-worn paths for planning, approving, funding, permitting, implementing. We just can follow the paths that we've been wearing down and carving through the wilderness here for the last 50 years. And so newer and more innovative solutions don't always have that path. They generally don't have that path, and folks need help creating that glide path to implementation. So navigating through these challenges, it's a big deal to work through the stage of single purpose infrastructure policy, or policies that are created for single purpose infrastructure, and try to implement something else on that stage. I know a lot of you that I do know in the room here have dealt with some of these really weird interactions among local, state, and federal policies. And that's the Godzilla versus Mothra here is always my shorthand for, especially if you have two federal level policies run into each other, or you're trying to implement local planning stuff in the context of intersections with sort of stodgy, old, inflexible state and federal policies. Weird stuff happens when policies come together that weren't ever intended to do that. So we can talk about some more examples of that if folks are interested, but we have some tools to help. And one of the things that I don't know if I hear this from infrastructure providers, but I see it in the lives of almost all of the innovative infrastructure folks that I work with, is that the policies make you responsible for continuing to run the old system while you're trying to build the new one. So you're running the old world off your desk, and off the side of your desk, you're trying to build a more innovative solution and kick it into gear and run it. And that's just that's a whole new set of policy challenges where you're trying to live in two universes at once.